Okay, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Pete Burden and I'm your host today on the Healthy Power Alliance podcast. We're using this space to explore what it means to be powerful together, to look at how human power, particularly as it appears in organizations and communities and movements, can benefit other humans and the planet we all depend upon. We're speaking to people who are in the middle of doing that, people who think they know how to do it, and people who are doing academic studies about it, of what works and probably what doesn't work as well. We love the theory, but really we're interested in the practice, the day-to-day, what people actually do. So with that little introduction, we'll get into our conversation today with our current guest, who's Maff Potts. So I'll just say a couple of words about you, Maff, and you can correct me where I'm getting it wrong. But my understanding is you're currently a director and founder of the Association of Camerados. I think it's such an interesting concept. I think I'll let you explain what it is. In your past, I mean, I looked at your LinkedIn profile and some of the things you've done. You've had kind of chief executive roles in the kind of social justice sector, I would say, and with a big focus on homelessness or trying to kind of work with people who are doing things about homelessness. And I'd love to hear more about that from you. Anything else I should kind of say really about you? I mean, you've been doing that for 25 years or so, something
Yeah,
like that.
I was working in the social justice world for 20 years, and then I started Camerados for the last 10, so 30 in total, I guess.
Very good. And so thank you so much for coming. I'm really
No.
looking forward to this. We've talked a little bit in the past, and I know you're a very interesting person to speak to. So I'm really looking forward to talking to you. Just before we get into the conversation, I'll say a little bit more about power and healthy power. Um, we know that the word power is highly contested in kind of academia, lots of different ways of talking about it. So we're using a very simple definition, and it's basically the ability to get needs met or to meet goals. And then healthy power is when you do that, when you get your needs met or you meet your goals in a way that actually helps other people to do the same. Because the opposite, we often think about it the other way. Well, I can get my needs met, but I'm taking away from you. So healthy power is this way of working which increases the power and well-being of everybody, including communities, environment, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So with that definition in mind, or any definition really, but could you just say something about when you first encountered power as a concept in your life?
In my life,
Yeah,
goodness.
yeah. You can
I
start
would
whenever you like.
I would say it's a little bit like light and dark. You become aware of one when you notice the absence of the other. And so I noticed power when I noticed the disparity between the way in which my father would speak to me at home and the way that teachers would speak to me at school. Because for the first 18 years of your life is pretty dominated by going into this power environment every day. And
School, you mean?
school, yeah.
Mm.
And I was lucky enough to have parents, but particularly my dad, who always treated me on the level.
Mhm.
Spoke to me very much like an equal, which was great for me. And we had a wonderful relationship. But when I went to school and suddenly these other people who I was meant to respect talked down to me, that was when I really noticed it and
Mm.
struggled with it, to be honest with you.
Mm.
And so I probably dealt with it for the first 10 years or so by being a bit of a swat and just kind of doing what they wanted. But then when I started to have my early glimmers of adulthood, sort of 16, 17, I started to actually lose respect for them, I think. And I much preferred people who spoke to me like my dad did. And that's probably when I started becoming a bit of a troublemaker,
Mhm.
because I didn't like the way authority spoke to me, which has been
Mhm.
a fairly big constant my whole career
Mhm. Mhm.
as
Well,
well.
you were labelled as a troublemaker by those people with power. Was that how it came about?
Yes, yes. I remember one teacher that I got on with very well actually coming out of the staff room one day and saying, good God, what is it you're up to? Because everyone in there thinks you're a threat, which is funny that the staff room should think that a 17-year-old kid was a threat. But yeah, I mean, I did sort of lead a revolt against the teachers on a number of occasions, on a number of issues and all of that. I was a bit I was probably a nightmare for them. I feel very bad about it. I was a precocious kid. But I've sort of that has been a bit of a vein of my of that in my career, probably trying to address the power imbalance. And it's certainly power is certainly something that Camerados has, which is this thing I've done for the last 10 years, has massively dealt with. I mean, I would say we were doing it for 2 years when Jenny, who I started it with, we looked at each other and said, don't you find that we talk about power all the time? And we had not expected that. And so that was a surprise for us.
Can you say a little more about a background about Camerados then, and then go into that, the power around it?
Sure. Well, I mean, having spent 20 years in very traditional institutional settings, where the power was very traditional, so charities and the government, I then started something in my bedroom that was quite different, which was a movement approach to change rather than an organizational approach to change. So social change through movements was something I felt I was much more drawn to, rather than organizations. So and started this thing called Camerados, trying to inspire people in their own communities to look out for one another and create these spaces called public living rooms, which are just places where you can come together for nothing more than connection. So they're no agenda spaces. So no agenda. So it's not a religion thing. It's not a particular medical condition thing. It's not a political group. There's no agenda. It's humans connecting, and there's also no outcome. So we're not fixing each other. And it's a space where you can be rubbish. You don't have to be a success. You mix with people who are not like you. You can disagree. And actually, what I'm verbalizing to you now are what became known as our 6 principles, which have stood the test of time with us actually over the last 10 years. And these principles actually are dealing with precisely what you're interested in, Pete, which is we suddenly realized we had to have the 6 principles in order to create healthy power, because much to our amazement, we created these spaces in the early days and there was bad power everywhere. And we were like, what's going on? And we discovered that people cannot help but buy into the bad power that society has schooled them in. And so you need these principles to sort of take the lime scale off the kettle and just remind people they don't need these bad power dynamics. They can actually have healthy ones. So we have these principles in our public living rooms, and then people can do them anywhere. They do them in hospitals, libraries, parks, bandstands, colleges, community centers. And there's 260 worldwide now in 6 countries. Most of them, but the great majority of them being in the UK.
Great. So, and the principles you're talking about, you offer as a kind of framework, as you're saying, to help people not kind of stay with the existing habits of kind of bad or toxic power. Could you give an example of something that might have happened in the early days or something?
Oh yeah, no, sure.
Flesh that out.
Well, I mean, the classic thing being, it got messy that people felt they had to sort each other's problems out and fix people. So people were suddenly buying things for people or putting them up on their sofa or kind of getting too involved in their life to sort all their problems out. And of course, that would go tits up pretty quickly. And so we had to say, no. I mean, one of the biggest things was we mistakenly created a cafe. Show me anyone who's tried to make change in social change, and at some point they've thought a cafe was a good idea. It's a weird thing. I think you have to get your cafe phase out the way before you do anything. So we thought, let's have a cafe. And instantly we lost all the mutuality, which is a word I haven't used yet, but I'm going to be using it a lot in the next few minutes.
Go for it.
When we talk is we are after a mutual approach to social change, and we think that's where the healthy power lies, not a hierarchical one. And unfortunately, we've all been schooled by society in hierarchical approaches. I could talk to you for hours about social Darwinism and Greco-Romanic hierarchies, but we're completely brainwashed into thinking that's the way the world has to work. And the 2 most common questions in a public living room when people come in for the first time are, who's in charge? What are the rules? Now that shows you how drenched in that kind of power relationship we all are. You create a total open mutual community space, and people say, who's in charge? What are the rules? People want you to have that framework. So we're all complicit in the bad power. We don't need someone to come in and boss us around. We want to be bossed around, or we want to know if we get to boss people around. So we totally played into that accidentally by creating cafes and not realizing that what we created was a counter and a till and a transaction and an entitlement and a hierarchy. So we were going into the public living room that used to be this beautiful mutual space. And we'd say to people, how come you don't clean up anymore? How come you don't make tea for anyone anymore? And the answer was always, well, that's the staff's job, isn't it? It's not my job. I've paid for my tea. They clean up. And you go, right. We've broken the spell.
Okay.
And so by giving people a role or position like that, it created an entitlement, it created a dynamic, a hierarchy. And so we had to close. It's a shame. I mean, we were making money from the cafe and people loved the cafe, but we were committed to mutuality, so we closed it.
So say more. This is fascinating. Say more about it, please. Because I mean, you want people to help each other in the settings, but you're saying that when there are different roles, like somebody behind the counter and someone the other side of it, that is distorting the power. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating that when I go out onto the pavements, because for your listeners, I ought to say that the activism that my little team does is to raise awareness. We create public living rooms in public places entirely illegally, without permission. We just pop up a sofa and some armchairs on a high street. But I learned that I had to buy a newspaper and sit down and read it in order for people to come along and say, what the hell is this? And I would have to say, I don't know, in order for them to sit down and treat me equally. If I sat there without a newspaper on my sofas and waited for people, first of all, they didn't sit down because they thought, who's this weirdo waiting to chat to me? But if they did sit down to me, they instantly thought, oh, he's staff. And they would say, so what are you offering? What are you selling? What's the outcome here? Whereas if I just sat down like one of them and read the newspaper and went, I don't know what this is, suddenly we'd talk about the weather and football, and they've just lost their wife, or their son's got a mental health issue, or the blah, 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 and or not that, or biscuits, or anything. And then we'd have equality, and we'd have fellow human just chatting. But if I had a staff written on me, or volunteer or lanyard, the relationship was completely different, and we didn't have any of that mutuality. They didn't look after me or look out for me because I had said, in this space I'm in charge. And that's effectively the same thing in public living rooms. If people have to dress the same. I mean, classic example being Bristol Student Union. It's the world's biggest public living room. 700 students a day use it. They had a major problem with mental health in the university. They'd had 12 suicides in 2 years. And they realized that students were not accessing the mental health support because, funnily enough, what a shock when you're having a mental health episode, the confidence to get a bus at a certain time of day to go across town to have a certain appointment and open a door was not going to happen because your confidence is in the toilet. So they realized that a public living room, creating this space where you can just kick off your shoes and have company, was the first step of them looking out for each other. So we did this, and the university put their foot down and said it must be staffed. And I said, no, none of our public living rooms have staff in them. They're just run by whoever wanders in. And they said, no, that's not going to fly. So we had to do a compromise with them, and we said, okay, whoever is in the public living room, can they just look like everyone else? Not have a lanyard, not have a T-shirt that says staff, whatever, which they did to begin with. And they agreed to it, and it worked, an absolute dream.
Okay. So in a case like that, actually the way it works is whoever is turning up will organize things, and then they do end up cleaning up and all of those kind of things. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, and
people muck in.
Yeah, and we call it we call it the sugar question. And that's because we had a public living room in Camden Town once on the street, and it was regular for about 6 weeks one summer. And a guy wandered in, and he wandered over to where there were these flasks of tea and coffee, and he turned around to everyone and said, "You've run out of sugar." And somebody shouted across to him, "Well, you'd better get some sugar then." And he walked out, and one of us said, "Oh, I think we've upset him. I think we've lost him then." 10 minutes later, he comes back with a Sainsbury's bag, brings out the sugar and says, "I've got sugar." And everyone in the public living room went, "Hey!"
Hey, lovely.
And it took something like that to make him go, click, 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 click. Ah, this is our space, right? Because he came with the attitude of, you are providing me the sugar.
Yeah, I was thinking that when you talked about a student with a mental health condition kind of crossing town, they're also not in the state to do that. But again, when they get there, they're going to have to interact with somebody who's got more power than them, a therapist or something like that. And you're just saying in the other setting, they just go and they just sit around and they don't have to engage even. They can just be there. Is it something like that?
Well, actually, that's really interesting. You remind me of a really great story we had in a further education college in Sheffield, where there was this kid who, forgive me, I can't remember which particular neurodivergent sort of condition, if that's the right word, he had, but there was some neurodivergence there, and he basically said he wasn't happy working in total silence in the library. He'd like to take his laptop where there were people and work with people, but he didn't want to talk to people. He didn't want to interact. He didn't want friends. He just wanted to be in the presence of people. So he would come into the public living room with his laptop and he'd work away. And week after week, he would do this. And he was quite an isolated kid. And then one day, there was a group of kids in the public living room arguing about Star Wars. And one of them said, "Han Solo's my favorite Jedi." And this was too much for this kid, because he knew that Han Solo wasn't a Jedi. Luke Skywalker's a Jedi, but Han Solo's he's a bounty hunter or whatever. No, he's a smuggler, isn't he? Anyway, so he said, "I'm sorry, but that's just not right. Han Solo's not a Jedi." And the kids went, "Nah, he is. He's got the black." No. If he was a Jedi, he'd have a lightsaber. And on the discussion went, and then before he knew it, he was being pulled into this conversation. Those kids then said, "Might see you tomorrow." The next day they were like, "Hey man, how you doing? Hey, listen, we're going to play a board game. Do you want to come over?" And he went, "Oh, okay." And it turned out to be Star Wars Monopoly. And, oh, well, he knows all about Star. Anyway, what I'm trying to show is that for the first 4 weeks, this kid didn't speak to a soul. He was just in the presence of others with no expectation ever placed on him. And out of it, he ended up with a friendship circle.
Sure.
And that did his confidence a world of good. And I think if it happens organically, without the pressure of an outcome or an expectation, not only does it end up being more profound and having more meaning, but I think it's much more likely to happen.
That's interesting, isn't it, as well? Because I think sometimes we think about power in terms of people, but there's also kind of power from expectation. If you have an expectation that something's good going to happen, which is really in yourself, I suppose, isn't it? You're thinking something like that, and then you fail or succeed according to whether or not you reach the expectation, and that sets up a kind of power dynamic that's quite difficult to deal with.
Well, if you're freed of that, it's amazing what can happen. And what I absolutely love, and it infuriates the hell out of the system, is if you just go in with no expectation, no outcome, no agenda, just see what happens. People talk in a different way. The conversation is better, I find. And whisper it quietly, we find a better outcome. I mean, outcomes do happen like crazy in our public living rooms, but we just don't set out to get them. And by not setting out to get them, that release of pressure. And I wish this would happen elsewhere, Pete, because let's think of one of the most obvious and most stark power dynamics in the world. Somebody walking down the street and a homeless person begging beside them. That's a very visual and very visceral demonstration of a disparity of power. Now, in the head of the person walking past, they're thinking, I should do something, but I can't do something. How much money have I got in my pocket? All these things are happening. Whereas if we just freed ourselves from any expectation and just said, all right, mate, what's your name? All right, Dave. Yeah, I'm Maff. Yeah. How's your day been? Bit shite? Yeah, it's crap, isn't it? Anyway, listen, man, I'm in a hurry, but listen, good to see you. Wouldn't that be better? Because the person would feel great. They'd feel seen, heard. The guy asked them the name, But, we're obsessed by a power dynamic that says, I need to fix this person, or there's something wrong here, instead of just seeing that homeless person as a person and treating them like anybody else.
Okay, so that's the kind of no fixing principle, isn't it? Exactly, you're talking about. And you're right, when we're in those kind of situations. And again, it kind of relates to money, that there's the disparity creates that. Thank you. This is incredibly useful, and I'm totally with you on the mutuality and all of that. I'm also really curious how you do that in practice, given that as an organization, you have to have funders, you have to have, there's a whole other world that you're in, isn't there? How do you marry the two of those things?
Well, so we've learned a lot. We've made tons of mistakes, Pete, and you've been around for a lot of them. You were a great help to us in the early days, and you'll know that we've wrestled with that power issue, and we just decided to keep them very separate. So my team is a community interest company, and is funded to support a movement over here. So we keep the movement totally mutual and everyday. People giving up their time to create a space for other people where they're all on the level. Might last a couple of hours on a Saturday morning. It might be open every day, but it's very gentle. It's light touch, none of the intensity of services at all. Kick off your shoes, have a custard cream, put the kettle on, see what happens, right? The company has a hierarchy because in the early days, we tried to pretend that there was no hierarchy anywhere, but that just isn't the case. So in the company, there is a hierarchy. I am the director. For a lot of it, I wasn't, because that's another story I'd like to talk about, if you could just put a pin in that, because I wasn't the boss. I created this thing as the founder, but I wasn't the boss for the first 5 or 6 years, 7 years. And I'd like to talk about that. But we did have a boss, and we did have a finance person, and we did have an arts activist, and social media and comms. And that was a hierarchy in order to get things done by Monday, by a certain time. There's a reason that works. It does work in companies, and that's why companies have it. That doesn't mean that you behave like a dictatorship. We had the hierarchy, and we did have people who had to make decisions, but we prefer to see it as roles. So I'm very much a subscriber to the servant leadership approach, which manifests itself mostly on a Monday morning team meeting, where I sit down and go, I don't know what the hell we're doing. And what the hell should we do about this? And I announce my ignorance at frequent intervals, whereby everyone has their say, and everyone's quite gobby, and everyone challenges me. But they know that I'm the one who in the end says, well, let's do that, what she said. And it works. So if your behaviors are reasonably flat structure-y, but ultimately there is some decision making, I think that can work. And then the movement gets to be as mutual as you can make it. I think in the early days, we tried to pretend we were a flat structure. And of course, what you have to look out for in those situations is what they call the tyranny of structurelessness, which you are very familiar with, but which I think it was something that happened in the feminist movement in the 70s, where everyone's equal. But of course, what happened was power exerted itself anyway, and you had elites form and cliques form, and it was toxic. So it's far easier in a small company scenario to say, no, there is a hierarchy, but knowing that, let's all behave as humanly as possible as we can. And so that is how we go with it. Can I also just say your point about funders? I'm hopefully quite canny about this, in that, having been a chief exec of a big charity with big salary bill and all of that, I realized various things happen. One of which is you lose sight of mission and become obsessed with money, and the preservation of the charity becomes more important than mission. I say that flippantly, but that really is a serious problem in the charity sector.
Sure.
And so I never wanted that to happen. So I knew I wanted to be small. So that mission always came first. I also knew I needed to be cheap so that funders weren't in for so much money with me that they poured over me and scrutinized me until this outcome-free zone I was trying to create was basically damaged and tainted. In order to create places where people don't feel they have to constantly achieve outcomes, you can't fill it full of forms. You can't behave like a service and use lots of labels and jargon. So therefore, we're small, we're cheap, we're under the radar. We have, a very small number of employees. There's only 5 or 6 of us, and most of them are part-time. I'm the only one who's actually full-time. It's various gradations of part-time. So 5 or 6 people, a bunch of associates we work with, and we split the funding for those 5 or 6 people amongst 3 or 4 funders. So no one's in for so much.
Okay. So that manages the relationships with the funders. The funders don't get too hands-on, too concerned about their investment they're making and all of those kind of things. They're not so outcome. I mean, and then therefore they give you some freedom
Yeah,
to operate.
I've had to fight for it, Pete. I'll be honest.
Okay.
I've had to be a bolshy bugger and say to the funders, you just don't give me enough money to ask for that. I'm not filling out your outcomes framework because you're not giving me enough to do that.
Yeah. Okay. No, I love that, and I love the split, the allowing the movement to do what it wants to do. This is really fascinating. Can you say a little bit more about the behaviours? So what I mean is, we're all particular kinds of people. You've got a very engaging way of kind of operating, Maff, and I can imagine you sitting on this sofa, reading the newspaper, and some person turns up, and you just kind of naturally engage with them. Is that something that's particular to you, do you think? And if so, what is it that you're doing that makes it possible for people to kind of engage with you in that mutual way?
Oh, if anything, I'm the worst person, Pete. And my wife said I started a social movement based on everything I'm shit at. Basically, I'm a problem-solving, sort of like addicted to urgency person, and I'm permanent state of outrage and anxiety all the time. So I'm a sort of nightmare person for the movement I've created. So what I've done over the last 10 years is because I'm appalled by the power dynamic that kind of person creates. I'm genuinely appalled by what happens when someone like me walks into a room. Other people shut up, and it mortifies me. So I've worked very hard on myself over the last 10 years to try and become more of a camerado, and so I shut up most of the time on the sofa, and with a few kind of interested noises and sort of well-chosen questions now and again, but ultimately just being like engaged with someone, fascinated by them and their story, and listening is something I've taught myself to do. Try and talk less, remove my own opinion from the situation a lot of the time, and that seems to work pretty well. There's all sorts of things, if I talk to a homeless person on the street, I tend to sit down on my ass on the pavement.
Get on the same level, kind of thing.
Yeah, there's all sorts
Physical
of
level.
ways, all sorts of ways you can do that, physical level, and so I try and keep things very mellow and chilled. But I've had to work on that, Pete. I'm not. You're very kind to say I'm naturally engaging, but I think that can sometimes go against you if you're trying to let others speak. You know what I mean? I've learned a lot. One of the biggest challenges to my own personal sense of approbation and job satisfaction was I realized that better things happen when I leave the room often, because I take up too much oxygen. So that was a real tough one for me. I had to really think about that. I can't be in all the public living rooms every day of the week, and yet there were 2,000 hours of public living room every week happening somewhere in the world, and I have to be okay with that. So not needing to be the savior is very important if you truly believe in mutuality, which I totally do. And all my heroes in the social justice world are those who try and level the playing field between people.
And that kind of tendency to be pushed into the savior role is strong, isn't it? as you said, kind of systemically.
Big time, and people are complicit with that in that they want you to be. So yeah, it makes my skin crawl to think of it, but some people want to know what Maff thinks, and is Maff coming and will he be there? And it's like,
Well, how come? I mean, I'm getting there are two sides to this. So you've got a side that really does all of that, and you have opinions and all those things, and you're deliberately kind of holding yourself back on these things. What's that like to have to do that? It must be difficult.
yeah, I mean, it has been a struggle. I mean, the thing I alluded to earlier was it was about 2.5 years into Camerados when Jenny turned around to me and she sat me down and she said, sweetheart, you're driving everybody mad and pissing everybody off. You need to know that. And I was like, what? And basically what had happened is I had classic founder syndrome, which is, this is my baby. I think about it 24/7. I'm involved in everybody's work plan and an opinion on everything everyone is doing all of the time. And it's a complete nightmare to be around, and nobody feels they have agency. And it was fantastic that Jenny had the strength and the friendship to tell me straight. So from that, literally that moment, she became chief exec. It was so for 6 or 7 years. And I worked to her. And I did my thing, which was the sort of external word spreading, if you like, and supported her as the boss. And that worked beautifully. And it kept me in check. And Jenny, thankfully, I was blessed with someone who makes it a joy to come to work. So I did have to watch that. It did take a chunk out of me, because you have to take a long, hard look at yourself. And I think we all have to, though, Pete, we all have to be aware of the power we exert on a situation, be that a social one or professional one. And I don't know if you've ever sat in a meeting and you're talking to someone and you suddenly realize they've got that red rash thing. That's happened to me, where my forcefulness of my passionate opinion, as I thought I was putting across, was intimidating them so much they were getting a nervous rash. It's so upsetting to see your negative effect you have on people. So I've worked, I hope, quite hard on trying not to be that guy. So yeah, it hasn't been easy, but I think it's for the best.
Yeah, working on your own power, very much. You're writing a book, or you've written a book that's about to come out. Can you say a little bit about what that's about then? And I'm curious as well, because in the past we've also talked a little bit about revolution, trying to kind of change things in the world. Could you spread it out a little?
I'm very proud to say that one of my heroes, David Robinson, who he's often called the godfather of the community sector. His quote is on the front of the book, which says, "Camerados is the revolution the world needs right now," which is a huge bit of personal satisfaction there. So we do talk about revolution, but I guess our revolution involves, in fact, the title of my last chapter in the book is "Sit Down and Don't Be Counted," which is the opposite of stand up and be counted, because we want people to connect and it not have to be a statistics game. We connect with each other because it's just what we need and what it's the right thing to do, and we all know that relationships is pretty much the answer to everything, and it's also the cause of everything. So the book came about because so many people have said, listen, this is fascinating what you're discovering with Camerados, about people, about spaces, about groups, about human nature, about what we need, and about the meaning of life, basically. And and the fact it came off the back of 20 years of working with people with very, very tough lives, they thought I would have something to say. I started it in 2018. It's now 2024. And it was power that I struggled with, because spending 180 pages being the only voice just seemed bad power to me. And I just felt terribly narcissistic. And I would write and write, and then I'd suddenly become aware of this guy going, and another thing. So I just would put the manuscript in a bottom drawer and go, nobody needs to hear from that wanker. And then I think it was a comment someone made. I was relaying stories from the streets. I met this guy called hall in Cardiff. I met this amazing woman called Joy in Scarborough or whatever. And people said, Maff, you have to write this down. These stories are priceless. And boom, that was it. I suddenly realized that the way to get over my narcissism was if I could write about these people and give their story a bit of a platform and hopefully connect them with the reader, because the reader might go, that's my sister, that's my mother, that's me. So that's what I've done. And the book is entirely made up of one chapter is a town, next chapter is one of my things I've learned, next chapter is a town, something I've learned. And so that's it. It goes kind of Belfast, Glasgow, Hastings, Liverpool, and then it'll be an idea about my approach to kindness, my approach to power, whatever. And that sort of felt it gave me permission to sound off.
No, it's fantastic. It's really good. And again, the same idea of you having to deal with your own kind of approach to things. I think it's so interesting that it comes right down to a very kind of internal exercise like writing. I mean, it's the same kind of self-knowledge, isn't it, in order to achieve that? I think that's amazing. Is it out, by the way, is it out now and can people buy it? Just want to say.
It will be out on February the 6th.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, we'll put a link in the notes and people can get that. We're kind of getting towards the time we need to stop. I mean, what else would you like to say about power? Anything else you'd like to say?
I think as we come into 2025, I imagine I'm not the only one who on New Year's Eve, it was pressing upon their mind of what lay ahead of us. And as we sit and speak at the start of this year, Pete, I think, in fact, you and I don't know when this will come out, but you and I are talking on the day that President Trump is inaugurated. We're probably, for some people listening, that'll be a moment of joy, but I think probably for quite a lot, it will be one of fear. And I think when we look at the macro of the world, it's a pretty bad time for power in terms of authoritarian approaches to power and top-down approaches. However, I guess I just want to be a little voice, hopefully, of positivity, which is as much as the macro is looms large in our media, the micro, the street level, the neighborhood by neighborhood power it is as positive and hopeful as ever. Because when I'm out on the street, people tend to give a damn about each other. I'm not sitting down with raging fascists all the time. I'm sitting down with people who are worried about their kids at school and looking out for their elderly mother who's not so well, and they're concerned with each other, and there's a lot of care and hope and love there and good humor. So I'd just be slightly wary of the media pushing the world's on fire message, because I don't find the world to be on fire when I go out on the streets.
Not at the individual level on the streets. No, that's great. All right, thank you. Is there anything else you'd like to add in terms of how people could get in touch with you or anything like that, or how they could set up their own living room, for example?
Well, there's various ways you can be involved. The first one is just to kind of follow us, and I mean, we're like anyone. We tell our stories on social media, so you can, if you find Camerados, it's a pretty unique name. You'll find us pretty easily. Have a look at our website, see if you want to get involved, and if you do, it's actually a really light, lovely thing to do, a public living room in your neighborhood. Get in touch. We'll have a half-hour chat with you on Zoom. And if the principles make sense to you, we'll send you the materials. And, on a Saturday morning between 10 and 12, take your furniture out on the street. I'm telling you, it'll be the most rewarding thing you do. And then you might want to do it once a month, once every 6 months, once a week, up to you. But I would encourage people to think about it. But in the first instance, just, find out more about us.
Get in touch. Lovely. All right. Thank you. Well, thank you so much. Fascinating stuff. Loved it. Maybe would be okay to get you back in a year's time or something like that to get some more reflections if you're up for that.
Well, certainly after this year, 2025 has
we'll see how it goes. Yeah.
Let's see if I was right about people.
Yeah.
Thank you, Pete. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. And for the rest of people out there in podcast land, we will be releasing a new episode soon. So watch this space.